Ruby and the Wizard by Sheldon King. Chapter 1. Grandfather. Grandfather was eccentric. That's what their parents said. That was what people said generally. Unusual was another word often bandied about. Of course, to children, like Poppy and Fred, there is no such thing as unusual. The world they know is the world, and that's that. Grandfathers were supposed to be like that. Well, some of them anyway. Theirs was currently in deep conversation with a spider plant. There is, as he was fond of pointing out, nothing wrong with talking to plants. After all, that royal chap did it, didn't he? This conversation, however, seemed very important. Grandfather's tone was urgent. He sounded unhappy and deeply worried. "Oh, I was just on the telephone. Shan't be a moment." "You don't have a telephone, Grandad." "Yes, of course. That's not the right word, is it? The connection is rather bad. I couldn't hear what the fellow was saying." "Grandad, it's a spider plant." "Yes, that's it. A spider plant. Very faint connection." At that point, their mother came in. "Is Grandfather talking to the plants again, dear?" she asked. "Not to the plants, through the plants. Quite different," said Grandfather, as if explaining something very simple to a small child. At that moment, the children's father joined them. "Oh, jungle telegraph, eh?" he said jovially. The joke bounced around the echoey hallway like tumbleweed. "That," said Poppy, her eyes narrowing, "is the very definition of a dad joke." "Fellow on the other end is on a vine or something, very unclear. He's an old shaman friend of mine in a spot of trouble by the sound of it. We have to go, kids, tonight, I think. It's rather a long way." Poppy and Fred had heard their parents earlier that day discussing in sombre tones about how their grandfather was becoming a little confused and fuddled, and perhaps it was really not safe to let the children go off on holidays with him alone any more. Mother was working up to finding a way to tell him. "Mother says we can't go on journeys with you any more," said Fred, looking solemn. "Dad says you might have a senior moment," said Poppy helpfully. "Don't worry, I'll explain it to them later," said Grandfather cheerfully. It is not right to listen in to grown-ups' conversations, but one had to be realistic. You could not rely on your average grown-up to see the big picture, and they might end up making all sorts of crazy decisions if you didn't keep an eye on them. It was helpful to stay one jump ahead and at least know what they were thinking. It was for their own good, ultimately. The door was closed, and Mother had her serious voice on. "We know you can look after yourself, but they are still quite young, and it's better to be safe than sorry." Father's voice was a low rumble, and it was hard to be sure he was saying anything beyond making it clear that he backed up what Mum was saying. Grandfather spoke calmly but firmly. "They are leaving tonight. We're going to Tibet, and you're both feeling really happy about it, should you even notice that they're gone." "Yes, we are really happy," said both parents brightly, if somewhat robotically. They emerged from the living room looking slightly dazed. "Have a nice time away with Grandad," said Mum. "Is Tibet far?" wondered Poppy. "Yes, it is," called Grandfather through the door. "We shall have to take the bike." Chapter 2. packing for adventures. The children knew how to pack for adventures. Many kids will announce that they're ready to leave, prepared for anything, but when in fact their knapsacks contain 4 or 5 cuddly toys and a pack of M&Ms. In contrast, Poppy and Fred had blankets, water, and 2 lunchboxes full of cheese and pickled onion sandwiches. They had been on adventures before. "Time to leave, kids." Grandfather's workshop was at the back of the house, backing onto a large overgrown garden with a lily-filled pond. A pagoda entwined with vines and unfamiliar exotic plants resembling crazy musical instruments and bobbing dancers. He emerged wheeling his latest creation, a large tricycle with a padded back seat like an Indian pedal rickshaw. "Jump in then." With the extra weight of the 2 children, lunchboxes and pillows, Grandfather was struggling to gain any momentum at all. A grassy tussock close to the main gate almost stopped their journey for good. The children looked at each other. Perhaps Grandfather really was past it. They jumped out and put their weight against the back of the rickshaw, gaining just enough traction to propel the vehicle out through the back gate. The bumpy dirt road up to the village caused even more problems, and Grandfather soon removed his jacket, sweat beading his forehead as he stood up on the pedals. Once on the main road, the rickety machine began to pick up speed. The old gentleman was whooping with joy, his hair flapping in the wind like a crazy flag. Poppy held on to Fred, Fred gripped the seat, and their trepidation turned to fear. As the bike swerved around the intersection and onto the freeway, their fear turned to terror. Ignoring the beeping horns and screeching brakes around them, Grandfather began to engage in the light, bantering conversation that adults enjoy torturing kids with. "Are you enjoying school? You are growing up fast. You must be eating your vegetables." After a short time, cars began to ignore them, and they somehow managed to pick up enough speed to join the flow of traffic. Grandfather handed what appeared to be World War I flying goggles to the kids, and they began to relax and wonder what Grandfather had in store for them. A police siren put an end to their peace, and they were joined by a furiously gesticulating motorcycle cop, flashing blue lights reflecting in Grandfather's goggles. "Oh well, it was fun while it lasted," said Fred. It was at that moment that Grandfather did something quite surprising. Ignoring the police motorcycle, he began to pedal faster. Hair streaming in the wind, he pulled a lever attached to a mysterious gearing system, and the rickshaw shot forward. Incredulous, the motorcyclist accelerated after the tricycle, but bizarrely, the machine was pulling away. Grandfather veered onto the hard shoulder and began overtaking the speeding traffic with ease. He turned and winked at the kids. They were off. The miles passed beneath them, and the sky began to redden as evening fell. It all seemed too good to be true, and indeed, before long, the sirens once again became audible. Blue lights were approaching on the other side of the barrier on the opposite side of the freeway. The motorcycle performed a dramatic U-turn through a gap in the barrier and was soon upon them. There was no escape. Grandfather pulled up, and in no time 4 police cars surrounded them and parked just ahead of them. The nearest officer removed his helmet and approached them. "What on earth are you doing?" he demanded. "Well, sort of a holiday, really. I guess you'd call it a working holiday," replied Grandfather good-naturedly. "You can't ride a bike on the freeway." Clearly, I can. Grandfather could say such things without a hint of rudeness. "I need to see your license." Grandfather made a show of searching in the many pockets of his tweed jacket. First he produced a piece of string, what appeared to be a straw voodoo doll, an ancient pocket watch, and finally, from his inside pocket, a rather dazed-looking pigeon, which he handed to the officer. The policeman took the pigeon, looked at it closely, then turned it over, and leaning on the seat of the back of his bike, he began to write in his notebook. That appears to be in order," he announced, smiling. but I'm going to have to give you a speeding ticket. No need, said Grandfather. We're stopping for the night. I have to feed my horse. It's 6:30, you know. The policeman looked at his watch. Aye, indeed, he admitted. I still have to give you a speeding ticket, and he handed Grandfather a piece of paper. Poop! An unusual outburst for Grandfather, as he deftly folded the offending ticket and quickly fashioned a paper aeroplane. Poop fire and save on matches, he cursed. At which point a small blue flame appeared from the rear end of the pigeon. Grandfather used this to ignite the paper aeroplane, calmly tossing the flaming craft off towards the freeway. This really is not good enough, said the officer. This is a serious offence. You should be more careful, said Grandfather sternly. Look, your motorcycle is on fire. The other police officers waiting nearby sprinted towards the bike and sprayed it with foam from the small fire extinguishers that they carried, presumably in case of flaming bird poop incidents. Meanwhile, Grandfather pedalled the tricycle through a small hole in the hedge and into a field. He then lay a mat upon the ground and began to build a fire. The children began to unwrap their cheese and pickled onion sandwiches. The police bikes revved up and disappeared into the night. Chapter 3. Magic Porridge. The next morning, the children awoke wrapped in blankets by the fire. The sun was still low and pink, their breath turning to steam in the air. Grandfather was tending a large pan on the fire. "What's for breakfast, Grandpa?" asked Fred. "Magic porridge." "How is it magic?" asked Poppy. "Well, it has nuts and banana in it," Grandfather replied. "That's tasty, but not magic," Fred pointed out, pedantically. "Well, eat your hard cheese and pickled onion sandwich crusts instead," said Grandfather, "and then see how magic it seems." The children were happy to admit that it was indeed magic, and began to eat it enthusiastically. Poppy, however, was still confused. "But why don't you just produce magic porridge? Why do you have to build a fire and cook it? Why don't you do it all by magic, like you did yesterday?" "I didn't do any magic yesterday," Grandfather insisted, scratching his head as if to remember. "Magic is extremely powerful. When you unleash powerful forces, you have to be prepared for all kinds of consequences you didn't expect." "But the policeman, the pigeon." "Not magic. People see what they're ready to see. The policeman was not ready to see a crazy man on a tricycle going 100 miles an hour on the freeway, so I showed him a sports car. That made sense to him, so he didn't question it. Most of the motorists didn't see us at all. I don't have a driving license, and a pigeon was the first thing that came to hand." "Where are we going? What's our mission?" The kids were impatient to know. "I told you, Tibet. My old friend is a shaman who lives up in the mountains. He's been trying to help a village that seems to have a dark enchantment upon it. The people are miserable and tired, and everything is falling apart. The shaman has tried everything, but he cannot seem to break the spell." As he was speaking, a large dappled horse had been slowly padding across the fields towards them. Grandfather began to stroke the horse's mane and whisper calm words into its large downy ears. He then lifted a hessian sack from the ground, and the horse dipped its long nose and began to eat. "Magic porridge," announced Grandfather. As his 3 companions ate, Grandfather worked on the tricycle. Muttering and straining with spanners and wrenches, he finally succeeded in removing the front wheel, and after a great deal more activity, he finally stood up, beaming proudly through a large oil smudge on his face. "Ready," he announced. The tricycle now resembled some sort of Roman chariot. "Come on, Ruby," he called, addressing the horse. The children rolled up their blankets and packed the chariot, as he walked the horse in broad circles around the fields. The skin of the horse began to shimmer, taking on a golden hue. Light seemed to emanate from the animal, and sparkles appeared in the air all around it. "Wow," said the children together. "Jinx," said Poppy. "I know, but wow," said Freddie again. "Are you telling me that that's not magic?" said Poppy, her face falling into her serious, no-nonsense expression. "Oh no, Ruby's parents were two Greek gods. They were only pretending to be horses, but they ended up making Ruby. As I said, you never know what unexpected consequences might result." "So kind of magic then," said Poppy, not to be fobbed off. "It's like this," said Grandfather, once the children were safely harnessed into the chariot, and Ruby was galloping across the fields and into the hills. "When those fellows invented the telephone and discovered they could hear themselves in separate rooms in the same house." "Alexander Graham Bell," said Freddie firmly. "Well, actually there were lots of people involved. Bell just got the patent, and we like the fact that his name is Bell, like a telephone ringing." "My dad's phone plays Unchained Melody." "Yes, but once... Well, anyway, they didn't really invent it, you see. It was kind of waiting for them. It was a force that wanted to come out. It took them ages to spot it." "You mean it's magic?" said Poppy, her eyes widening. "Kind of," said Grandfather, struggling to hide his frustration at so many interruptions. "Do you think they had any idea that the result would be that people would end up wandering around in a daze like zombies, unable to concentrate on anything, constantly wondering if they were missing something and where they might find a charger? Well, that is what happens when you unleash a force you don't understand," he yelled triumphantly. As he had been speaking, the horse had been gathering speed and seemed to be getting larger. The chariot, too, seemed to be becoming more spacious and luxurious. A golden rope appeared from the edge of the seat and secured the children. "What the—" Poppy was making her no-nonsense face again. "Ah, yes, that was actually magic," said Grandfather. "Better to be safe than sorry." Ruby, the horse, unfurled huge golden wings, and the horse and chariot began to rise into the air. As the ground dropped away below them, Freddie remarked that the fields resembled a giant patchwork quilt, and Poppy, who would be the first to admit she had a sweet tooth, suggested it looked like a delicious marzipan cake, the houses blocks of chocolate, and the trees squidgy marshmallows. Perhaps the kids had not slept too well under the stars because their eyes began to close, and soon Freddie was dreaming of the biggest, softest bed in the world, with a lush green forest of pillows and dreams trickling through the gentle streams. And Poppy was endlessly taking the first bite of the sweetest cake you can imagine, with chocolate sauce and fresh strawberries. Waking briefly, the children were aware of the ocean below them, pale grey from the light of the moon. They could hear the low music of Grandfather's voice, and Poppy thought how much like a sprinkling of castor sugar the stars and galaxies seemed, tossed across the darkness by some extravagant chef. Freddie looked at the smiling bunny face on the moon and felt safe and secure. "Sleep more," Grandfather intoned, noticing them stirring, and he moved his hands in a strange arcane gesture in front of his chest.